Hey class. In this video I'll be covering JavaScript classes. Classes and objects are sort of interchangeable in JavaScript. They have some syntactical differences, but for the most part they're basically the exact same thing. You may have heard of the term object-oriented programming. That's what we'll be looking at in this class and in the next few videos. This is a very important concept to learn as a developer. It's sort of what leads us to be able to create more sophisticated and organized and structured code. So I'm going to be working with the assets and some of the basic code from our project that we've been working on so far this semester, but I'll be kind of starting it from scratch to show how I would build something using classes. So to get started, I'm going to open up GitHub as usual. So I'll get my MMP 310 repository and make sure everything is up to date. And I'll go ahead and open it up in Sublime and increase that a bit. And then I'm going to go back to GitHub Desktop and click Show in Finder. So here I'm going to make another copy of project 1-5. That's where we left off last week. And so I'm just going to hit Command D to duplicate on the Mac and make project 1-6. And hopefully this will be the last version of this project that we'll be creating. So I'll be using a lot of the assets in here, but I'll be rewriting most of the code from scratch. And I'll go ahead and delete that thumbnail. We'll eventually create a new one. So before I get started, one thing I want to actually have open is the code from the last project. I can obviously have it open in Sublime, but sometimes it's nice to have it open in a different place so I don't get confused. So I'm going to go to my GitHub. So I'm going to go to my GitHub and go to project 1-5, and I'm going to open up sketch.js. So I'm going to end up wanting to borrow some code from here from time to time. And so if I have this readily accessible, that way I can just go read it and copy and paste things that I need. But it's nice that it's not in Sublime, so I won't get confused about which files I'm looking at. And so some of this stuff we are going to be using. A lot of it we will be replacing with other concepts. So I'm going to open up sketch.js, and I'm going to go ahead and just delete everything in here so I can start from scratch. So I'll save that and just make a new comment. So this is project 1-6, object-oriented version. Okay, so we're going to be introducing classes and objects. What object-oriented refers to is basically that instead of writing a bunch of functions and a lot of variables like we did in the first version of our game, instead we're going to be organizing our code into different little things called objects. And I'll go over basically the concept of an object and then talk a little bit about some syntax. So an object essentially is like a blueprint for something. So for example, we're going to start with a game object. So we're just going to have like this idea of a game object, and we're going to try to break down what are the common components of the different parts of our game. So we have our player, we have some trees, we have some clouds, and we have the little signs. We also have the snakes in the arcade level. We will deal with that in another video. So for our main kind of game objects, these are the things in our game. We kind of want to look at what makes them similar and what makes them different so we can start to organize them, and so we don't have to repeat our code as much. So one thing that they all have in common is an image. They all use an image, at least one image, to be drawn on the screen. The player or character uses a few images, so that's one thing to keep in mind. So they all also have an X position and a Y position. And then, so those are some properties, values that, we save with our object. They also have a function. All of them have to be drawn on the screen. So we can call that like a draw function. So these are properties. And then we also have functions. A function that's part of a class or an object is referred to as a method. And properties is like another name for a variable. Variables and properties are kind of the same thing. Functions and methods are kind of the same thing. In JavaScript, everything is kind of the same, so it's a little confusing. But that's basically it. So all of these objects have an image, they have an X and Y, and they also have to be rendered to the screen. In our current version, that uses the image function. So we, at some point, have to use the image function in order to draw them on the screen. The things that make them different, the player has some controls that can move it around. And the clouds also kind of change positions. And then our signs have this sort of like portal-like quality where the player can hit a button to enter a new scene. We'll have to kind of divide as we go through. We'll think about what are the things do our things have in common versus not. And then we'll make different objects and different classes based on those differences and similarities. Really quickly, I'm gonna just get this started. So I'm gonna say function setup, create canvas. So we'll stick with our window width, window height for now. And then I'll have my function draw. And for now, I'm actually not gonna draw anything in here. I guess I'll draw a background just so we can see that it's working, but we'll eventually replace that. And then I'm gonna go to tools and make sure my Sublime server is running. And let's go back to my browser and go to localhost 8080. So here I'm gonna go to project 1-6. I haven't created a link for this, but I will eventually. And just open the console so we can get ready. Let's talk a little bit about how objects work, and I'll just do some demonstrations in the console. So we haven't used these before, but they're pretty simple. Basically, with an object, an object is like any other variable, except instead of having one value, it has what's known as keys and values. So it has multiple values that are stored inside of keys. So an object, usually we would write something like variable O for object, and then 2 curly braces to represent an object. And then we can add components to the object using dot notation. So I can say object dot, let's say, x equals 0. So now if I look at that object, I have an x and a 0. So if I say O dot y equals 0 as well, now I have an object with an X and Y position. And so this is basically just like a nice way of organizing our code. This X and Y are sort of like variables that only relate to this O object. Okay, so that's just like a basic simple object. So in this case, we have what's called keys. Okay, so the keys are X and Y, and those keys have values. Okay, so the value for X is 0, and the value for Y is 0. And so we can reference the value of each key just by saying O.X, O.Y. So it's just like a variable, except now it's assigned to this specific object. And the thing that's nice about that is we can have multiple objects. Like let's say I have another object, J, and here I have X equals 1 and Y is 1. That's another way to create an object where I add the key value pairs from the beginning. So now I have J with X and Y, and now I can refer to O.X and J.X. So I don't have to like say, Jerry X and another character X. I can just create these objects, and then I can assign as many keys or values as I want to. Another nice thing about this is I can also assign functions, not just variables. So I could say like O.sayHello equals function, and then I could create a function. I could just console.log hello. So now my object has an X, a Y, and a function associated with it. So I can say O.sayHello and call the function, and it logs hello to the console. So that's kind of a simplified version of an object. It's not super useful for what we're going to do, which is create classes. So that's mostly the syntax we'll be using. So I'm just doing this to demonstrate a little bit how an object works. But in the code, we're actually going to be creating classes. And the way that we're going to do that is we're going to think about, again, what do we need in our scene? So we have this sort of like generic game object class That's anything that is going to be part of our scene. And then from there, we're going to also have subclasses like the player, like a portal, like we have those little signs that we can click on to go somewhere else. I'm going to refer to that as a portal because it's kind of like a portal to a new scene, but you could really call it whatever you want. And so we're going to kind of take this one idea of a game object as a blueprint to create these other objects that we need in the scene. And the nice thing about this is it makes it so that our code is, instead of repeating the same thing over and over again, we're going to be able to reuse the code. So let's go over the syntax for that and start thinking about how to create classes and objects within the game. So I'm just going to start with a simple class. And one thing that I'll often do when I'm doing object-oriented programming is I'm actually going to open up a new panel in my Sublime Text because it makes it very easy. When I have like multiple files, I want to be able to kind of see more than one at a time. So if you've never done that before, it's very easy to do. You can hit Command Option and then 2 to open a new panel, or go back with Command Option 1. You can also go to View and Layout and go to 2 columns. And then one thing that I like to do is get rid of the files if I'm using 2 columns, so I have a little bit more space. I do that by just hitting Command and then KB real quickly. But you can also go to View and just go to Hide Sidebar, and then you can go to Show Sidebar. So I might be kind of switching in between those different views as we go through our program. We're going to start with a generic class, which is the game object class. So I'm going to say class game object, and then with a game object class, I don't need parentheses. I'm just like declaring the name of the class. I also use a capital letter here, and then I have curly brackets to kind of encapsulate my code for this class. So it's really easy to create a class. You'll notice that I'm in a new file, so when I hit enter, I'm going to save, and I'm going to save this file in the same folder. If I had like a million classes, I might want to create some subfolders, but for now I'm just going to use the same folder as my sketch.js, and I'm going to call this gameobject.js and then save. And so now we have a game object file here. That's kind of our main generic class for anything that we want to display in the game, like a tree or a cloud or our player. One thing that I have to be careful about is once I add new JavaScript files, I do have to include them in my HTML file. So just like we included the sketch.js and our P5 library, if I create new classes, I have to make a new script tag to load that class. And the order is also kind of important here. So I'm just going to make a little comment here. And so we know that we're adding our classes here. So I'm going to say game object. That's going to be one of our main classes. And then, so I'll go back to sketch.js over here. So for a game object, the things that we determine were kind of like the main things that we need for any game object. We put in what's called the constructor. So the first function in a class is always the constructor. This is sort of like if you think of the class as a blueprint for how to make something, the constructor sort of like builds that thing. And the constructor takes arguments. So these arguments might be different depending on what you're doing with your project. Like if you have lots of different things going on. For our game objects, the things that we determine we know that they need as far as properties are the image. So I'm going to use img as a abbreviation here, the x position and the y position. For anything else, we'll have to create other subclasses, which we'll get to later in the video. But for now, we know just like to create a simple object in the scene, we need, at the very least, we need these 3 things. The image, which is the image we want to draw, and then the X and Y position of where to draw it on the canvas. One of the weird things about object-oriented syntax is that we start using a thing called this a lot. This is basically just a keyword in JavaScript, which essentially says like this refers to each individual instance of this game object. So the reason we need to do that is when we create objects, we have this like our game object class is a blueprint. Okay, so this is the blueprint. But when we make game objects, like if we have like a bunch of trees, which is where we're going to start. So each one of these trees is based on the same code. And so this tree has an X and a Y and an image. This tree has an X and a Y and an image. and this tree has an X and a Y and an image. And since there's 3 of them, the way that we know which one we're referring to is by using this. So this is a keyword that specifies each one of these individual trees. So once we create a tree, they get their own this that basically tells us that we're referring to that tree. So the reason that that's important is if we have, other variables, like if we have an X variable over here, that way we know that we're referring to this X and not this X. So the first thing that we do with our game object is we actually just assign our arguments to this. So we say this.image equals image, this.x equals x, and this.y equals y. This is almost always the case with these arguments for a class. Sometimes an argument might be used only in the constructor, like if we're using like a random number of something that we want to add or something like that. Sometimes you'll only use the argument once inside the constructor function, but usually what you do in the constructor function is actually just assign all of these values to our constructor. And so by assigning all these values to the constructor, we'll be able to use them in other methods within our class. Another thing that we could do here is give a width and a height based on the image. So that way we can refer to the width and the height without having to refer to the image. So that's another nice thing that we can do in a constructor. So I can say this.width equals image.width, and this.height equals image.height. So that way I don't have to always refer to the image if I'm using width and height. This is going to be really useful for us later when we start to add things like the collisions. So that's our constructor that creates the object. The only thing we have to add now is a draw function to draw our object. So I'm going to just make a draw function here. One of the nice things with the class syntax is I can just write my functions. I don't have to put like function draw here. It's just kind of assumed that when we're inside of this class, that when we use this syntax, we're creating a new method related to this class. So I'm going to do a draw. In that, this is a really simple function. I'm just going to say image and then this.image at this.x and this.y. So it's very simple. That way we don't have to repeat this over and over again. So, if we look back in our sketch from our previous project, we can see how often we use that, right? We have image Jerry walk, image Jerry idle, image tree image. In our functions, we have, the snake image down here somewhere. So we use it like a million times. This way, this is actually the only time we're going to use that image function because every image is going to get drawn as a game object. So this is everything that we need to create some of our simple game objects. So we can look at how to actually instantiate an object in our sketch. So right now, if I reload the sketch, we don't see anything on the screen because I haven't actually asked the sketch to do anything. Game object, however, we can see is a class that's available to us. And so we can create a game object. So one thing that we do need for that is an image. So let's add some of our images. So we have the variables, Jerry, idle. I'm just going to steal these from my previous code actually, because we do need all the same images. So we have Jerry idle, Jerry walk, Jerry jump, and then we have some of our other images. And I'm going to steal our preload function from here as well, so I don't have to like rewrite all of that stuff. That's going to be the same. We need to still load all of our assets before we create anything. So that looks good. We have our preload function here. So now I just want to make some trees. Our tree is basically like the simplest object we have because it doesn't move, it doesn't collide with the character, and it doesn't use any events. So what I can do to make a tree is pretty simple. Let's just start with a variable and then I'll add an array because we're going to have more than one tree. So if I have a tree variable, I can declare it here. And then in setup, when I make a new instance of an object, I just say tree equals new game object. And then I just have to match my 3 arguments that I want in my object. So the image is the tree image. And then the X and Y position are just whatever I want those to be. So I could go and look at my code and grab these tree positions, but I'm just gonna, kind of start from scratch here. So let's put one at like 100x and maybe 200y, and see what that looks like. So then in my draw function, I'll say tree.draw. And there we go. We have a nice little tree. So that's great. If we wanted to do that, make another one, I would just recreate this code with another variable. Obviously, that's going to start to get tedious, and it's not really going to save us that much time. So we can do an array here. So a couple ways that I can do that. So let's delete this tree. So I'm going to make a variable trees, and I'm going to assign this to an empty array. And so I can now add trees by pushing them. And I can also, push a whole bunch of trees using a for loop or something like that. So if I wanted to push a new tree, I could say trees.push. And so then I would say new game object. And again, use the tree image as the image. And now I can just add the same X and Y here. Make this a little bit smaller. And now instead of just drawing one tree, I'm going to use a loop to draw the tree. So I'm going to say for let I equals 0. I is less than trees.length, I plus plus, and then I'm going to say trees at I dot draw. Okay, now we have a tree that looks very nice. And so if I want to add another tree, I'll just copy this code and paste it. And I can move it over on the X. Okay, I can move it down on the Y. I can play around with those values. So you're starting to see, I'm basically repeating what we had here with our X and Y for our trees. The thing that's kind of nice about this is that now I can see the X and Y are directly related to this tree. And so if I wanted to do something similar to like what I had with my tree foreground, where I just had a loop down here, I could recreate that as well. So I could just copy this. And really all I'm doing there is adding a bunch of X values. So I'll just say trees.push, and then I'll do new game object, tree image. And then I'll use the X that's in this for loop. So I'll say X, and then the Y value is height minus 100. That looks a little bit long. Another way that I could do this is I could say variable tree, or actually let's use let tree so it's scoped. So this might look a little bit simpler. Equals new game object with the tree image, the X value that I'm getting from this loop up here, and then height minus 100. So they're all going to have the same Y value, and then I can say trees.pushTree. And so now I should have a bunch of trees down there at the bottom. That looks pretty good. I haven't actually turned on image mode center yet, so let's go ahead and do that. So that will place the trees differently, so that looks a little bit better. And now I can like kind of adjust down here. Like if I want to move this tree down, I just place that number a little bit lower. If I want to put some more trees here, I can just add another one of these guys, and maybe we'll put one at width minus 100. So that looks kind of good, and put it farther down here as well. So we can start to add trees just by using the X and Y like this. We can also use a loop to add a bunch of trees. And then notice that I haven't actually changed my draw function at all. As long as I have this loop drawing my trees, I don't really have to do anything else. It's going to draw however many trees I add. So by combining the array with my class, all these trees, I don't even have to know what the X and the Y of the tree is, because they keep track of their own X and Y.